Okay. In our last module, we discussed some of the theories of social class, and we talked about two very important thinkers, obviously, in sociology, Marx and Weber, and their ideas of social class. But a pretty long time has gone by since those people said those things, and it's probably a good idea for us now to update or take a modern look at some of the things that they said. So we can, now update the theories of social class proposed by Marx and Weber. So let's take a look at Marx first. One of the criticisms of traditional Marxism is that the model is far too simple. As we said earlier, Marx talked about the idea of there being only two classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat, solely based on ownership of the means of production. And when we look at modern society, it seems a little perhaps far-fetched to think about there being only two classes. Marx's theories have been more or less updated to kind of accommodate some more modern concepts and values. So in the modern Marxist definition of social class, we've expanded out now to four classes. Okay, and we see them labeled here. The first being what we kind of call the traditional capitalists, and these are, again, still the owners of the means of production. However, we're going to include a new kind of dimension to the definition, and that is that the capitalist class are the owners of the means of production. However, they employ lots of labor. So in other words, they have lots and lots and lots of people working for them, or they buy lots of labor. So again, we're back to our kind of a traditional idea of a factory owner, or in this case we could say the owner of a really large business, a corporation, very large companies, in which there's basically kind of an idea of sole proprietorship. The person, again, can still own, sell, buy, do whatever they want with the company, but employ people on a large scale, and that would be the capitalist class. The next stage would be the petty bourgeoisie. Again, a thing that was kind of left out of traditional Marxist definition was what about something that may not have existed quite as much or been as prominent during Marx's time, but clearly we look around today, the idea of small businesses. Clearly small businesses are run very differently and have different priorities as well as challenges than a very large business, like I say, a factory or a corporation. And that's this distinction, the petty bourgeoisie. So think about this in terms of, let's say, a person who owns a corner pizzeria or a bakery. They still, much like the capitalists, own the means of production. However, the scale of the business is small, and the biggest distinction largely being how much labor do they employ. And again, a person who owns a pizzeria might have 3 or 4 employees, a couple other people making pizzas, and a driver, and that's about it. So we've now, if you look at this, we still are more or less including the bourgeoisie in these first two distinctions. We're talking about people who own the means of production, but we're introducing a new dimension, the employment of labor and scale to the entire thing. And then the second two, or I should say the second two, but the third class we can come up with is the managerial or manager class. So, as I mentioned in the earlier module, even within the factory, there's a pretty big difference between the person who shows up and, in a suit and tie and sits up in an office at the top of the factory running everything, and the janitor at the very bottom, quote unquote, at the bottom of the employee scale. And that's the distinction we're making here, that the managerial class and the working class do not own the means of production. But again, what are they distinguished or separated by? And the element we'll enter here is the idea of the amount of control or power they have over other workers. So a manager, let's say a manager of a factory, might have thousands of people under his or her employ and can make a lot of decisions, sometimes to the basis of hiring, firing, those kind of things. But for the most part, their authority over the other workers is much greater than, let's say, like I said, the janitor at the very bottom of the pay scale, who basically can't tell anybody what to do. They're the person being told what to do. So in this case, we are still, if if you look at these two distinctions, we still have the bourgeoisie and proletariat classes, but we've divided the proletariat up into managers who have power or authority over other workers, and then the traditional idea of the working class, who have very little control or power either over themselves or other workers. And another thing that this allows, this modern definition, again, traditional Marxist theory was you were either bourgeoisie or proletariat. There was no being both. In today's society, we can look around and realize that people sometimes play multiple roles, and we can say, is it possible for people to sometimes occupy some of these roles, which may even seem to some degree contradictory, at simultaneous times? And the answer would be yes. So you could say that a capitalist who, let's say, owns the means of production could also work for somebody else and gain a wage or a salary. So we see this when we talk about CEOs who maybe sit on boards of directors of other companies which they don't own. Or we could say that, would it be possible for a person who owns their own business, let's say, like I said, a small mom and pop store or a pizzeria, bakery or something like that, then to also work for somebody else in a different capacity to earn a salary on the side or increase their income. So we can clearly see that it's possible in this definition, in this expanded definition of Marxist definitions of social class, to be able to occupy more than one position in society at the same time. When we take a look at Weber and expanding our definition of what Weber said, we can, I'll just move over here so we can take a look at it. Again, Weber's distinctions about class are still based on the 3 Ps. So it's ownership of, or the proximity to property, power, and prestige that's going to determine these. And Weberian class distinctions basically divide society up into 6 classes. And when we look over here and look at modern American society, we can make some distinctions as to what percentage of the population falls into these different classes. So a large part of this is going to be based on things like income, but there will be some ideas of, again, occupation or occupational prestige. So when we talk about the capitalists, once again, we are actually talking about the power elite in society, those people who represent the top 1%. So these are extremely wealthy people, again, CEOs and celebrities, people whose incomes generally exceed well over $1 million per year, and once again represent about 1% of the population. When we talk about the upper middle classes, we're usually talking about people in professional occupations, once again, doctors, lawyers, upper management within businesses, those kind of things. Usually people whose salaries exceed $125,000 to $150,000 again per year, so not just one year, but consistently every year. And those people represent about 15% of the population. When we talk about the lower middle classes, we're usually talking about semi-professionals. So again, teachers, managers, mid-level of managers, craftsmen, again, skilled laborers, people like electricians, plumbers, those kind of things. Usually people whose incomes range in about the $60,000 to $100,000 a year range would be considered lower middle class. Then we'd be talking about the working class, again, factory workers, people working in clerical jobs, sometimes what we call, for a lot of female employees, pink-collar jobs or blue-collar jobs. And usually people whose salaries average, again, around the $30,000 to $40,000 a year range would be considered working class, and that's about 30% of the population. The working poor are sometimes what we call underemployed. So usually people who are working labor jobs, sometimes temp jobs, people who work in largely service jobs, as we said, waiters, waitresses, those kind of things. Usually people whose incomes usually start at around the $20,000 to $25,000 range would sometimes consider the working poor, and those are people, and they represent about 16% of the population. And then the underclass, people who are largely unemployed on welfare, who get maybe subsidized or very little salary at all, usually people making less than what we sometimes call the poverty line, which varies again from time to time. We'll discuss that in a little bit. But usually people making less than $18,000 to $20,000 a year would be considered the underclass. So when we look at this, we see that clearly the distinctions here made by class are based on our definitions of the 3 Ps. We mentioned all those things: occupational prestige, power, and property. And when we look at the percentages, again, this is very appealing to functionalists who like to think of society as a well-ordered thing. And we kind of see that we have very few people at the top and bottom, and a much bigger group in the middle. If we're looking at it kind of in terms of population. And this resembles what we call a bell curve, which again, for functionalists is nice, because what it's basically saying is the most people in society fit the middle, where there's fewer people on the outsides. So very few people at the top, very few people at the bottom. And we look at this and we look at the middle 2 classes, lower middle and working classes, we see about 64%, or roughly 2/3 of the population fall into these middle 2 classes. So again, for a lot of functionalists, this is a great distribution, and it seems to indicate that again, we've got this very large middle class that exists. How do we reconcile that, let's say, with what we were talking about before, this idea of upper middle and lower classes and wealth inequality? Well, we could just take the same numbers and actually maybe distribute them in a slightly different way. So we could actually say that, let's say we took a line and put a line here and called that the upper classes, and we'll put a line here and call it the middle classes, and below that line would be the lower classes, and take a look at those percentages. And let's go back to our old pyramid here and say that those first 2 groups are about 16% of the population, and then we say that the next group is about 34% of the population, or roughly double that. And then when we look at the bottom, 30 and 16 and 4 add up to 50%. So, is there really much of a distinction between looking at things perhaps from, like we said, that traditional upper middle lower class, or when we look at the Weberian ideal and divide it up among 6 classes? Really no. It's just a different perspective, or a different distribution of roughly the same numbers. So we can see that despite the fact that there may appear to be a pretty wide distinction between looking at things from, let's say, an updated Weberian point of view or a more traditional upper middle lower class point of view, the numbers are almost exactly the same. It is our perspective and how we choose to interpret those numbers